We got 10 minutes each?
You have 10 minutes each.
And thanks very much. I welcome the opportunity to speak on this important bill, Cathaoirleach. I do, however, have a number of very serious concerns about the bill and the proposed merger of the RPA and the NRA. As a starting point, for example, the bill itself is concerning because it's called the Roads Bill, and the Transport Infrastructure Service, it's not called the Transport Infrastructure Service Bill or the Transport Infrastructure Authority Bill. And any further attempts to promote public transport and to move away from car dependency, I believe, will be hampered because the main body, the NRA, will naturally be more focused on road-based transport options rather than trying to develop the state's light and heavy rail infrastructure. I want to commend, obviously, the staffs of both the NRA and the outgoing RPA for the work they've done for our state over the last decade or so in particular. But inherently, the NRA and the RPA have competing interests. In fact, ministers, both agencies have always been direct competitors. Their competing interests, I believe, will be impossible to reconcile in a merged body. Surely roads-based projects will take precedence. You just have to listen to earlier contributors in that regard. On that point, there's a potential that the merger of the RPA and the NRA, as proposed under the bill, could in fact be in breach of the Competition Act. And I wonder, did Minister Varadkar remotely consider that? Any element of competition that currently exists between the different modes of transport, between public mass transport and car, if you like, personal-based transport, is now effectively going to be eliminated by this government. There's also a grave concern that no new light rail projects will be realised in the medium to long-term future because of the horrendous bailout mortgage that this country has now on its back. Indeed, many people wonder what will be the impact of this merger on the Lewis Cross City project itself, despite the assurances given to us by Minister Varadkar. I noticed in Minister Varadkar's speech, of course, at the introduction of this bill, he spent a lot of time talking about the cutting of quangos, elimination of quangos, classic kind of Fine Gael troika type tripe that he and his colleagues have given us over the last 5 or 6 years. And the result today, I think, will be bad for public transport in this state. Obviously, the existing functions of RPA will transfer to the NRA as provided for under Section 6. However, the provisions regarding functions of the Merge Authority are weak. For example, Section 16 provides that additional functions may be conferred on the Merge Authority by the Minister for Transport, Tourism and Sport with the consent of the Minister for Public Enterprise, Expenditure and Reform. But that's not a mandatory obligation on the Minister, and the functions of the merged body will be at the total discretion of the Minister going forward. I'd suggest again that this provision points to the intended restriction of the merged body's functions primarily or exclusively to roads-based transport option. And Section 17 relates to the potential for the Minister to request the authority to arrange for the procurement of goods and services in relation to regional and local roads, but it makes no mention of light rail or other transport options. Interestingly, Cathaoirleach, there's no mention of light rail in any of the provisions concerning the functions of the new authority. Why wasn't there specific reference, Minister, in this regard? And you're the Minister indeed for commuter transport. I note that the Transport Infrastructure Service may well be the name after the dissolution day of the RPA, but the merged authority, I think, will still be referred to as the RPA. And we have to remember, Cathaoirleach, and this House has to remember, that this bill is taking place against the background of savage cuts in the public service obligation, savage cuts in our existing rail and road-based public transport. NTA, for example, has recently provided figures to me on the distribution of the available subvention between Dublin Bus, Irish Rail and Bus Éireann. This was in response to a PQ I asked Minister Varadkar in January of this year. The total PSO in 2011 was just under 265 million euros. That's now been slashed, Minister, this year down to 209 million euros. So effectively, we've had a 20% cut in an already very small PSO budget for public transport. And Cathaoirleach, has to be remembered that in most jurisdictions, you think of cities like Amsterdam, great cities. I have to say, by the way, I think the whole direction of this bill and of Minister Varadkar is very anti-Dublin. It's a ferocious attack on the people of the Dublin region in particular. and it's very anti-other urban centres. It's a device designed, in fact, to promote the lack of public transport going forward in this state in the future. The share of the PSO for Dublin Bus has also been slashed from 73 million when this government took office to 60 million in 2014, a disgraceful situation in which people who would pretend to represent Labour interests and trade union interests and public sector interests would be involved in such a government that would do this, Minister. The share of the PSO for Irish Rail also slashed from 149 million in 2011 right down to 117 million this year in 2014. The share of the PSO for Bus Éireann also slashed 43 million in 2011 right down to 32 million in 2014. Now, the real effects of these huge cuts to the PSO are being borne out every day, Minister, in terms of poorer services provided to passengers around this country, both in urban and rural areas, and very difficult conditions for employees of Dublin Bus, Irish Rail and Bus Éireann. It's been reported in recent weeks that workers at Éireann and Irish Rail may go on strike because of further cuts to pay being proposed by the company following the Labour Court's recommendations and following your cuts. Obviously, management of Éireann are under huge pressure because of these terrible cuts to their PSO. We've begun to get a movement, I think, in the development of rail-based transport 5 or 6 years ago in this country. That's now all been lost. We already have a public transport service creaking at the seams, and we're still very heavily car dependent. According to Eurostat figures, for example, from 2002 to 2011, the modal split of passenger transport was between 83–84% on car-based transport as against public transport. Minister Varadkar's neoliberal agenda, and that is his agenda and always has been his agenda and the agenda of Fine Gael, and this rubbish about quangos and references to other important public service bodies and agencies, it shows quite clearly he doesn't believe, and Fine Gael doesn't believe, in public transport services, and he wants indeed to privatise those services. That's the agenda. And yet we only have to look across the sea, Cathaoirleach, to the neighbouring jurisdictions, to the UK, to see what happens, that the privatisation of important public transport services, it proves the old adage that the only thing worse, Minister, than a public monopoly is a private monopoly. You only have to look at the UK bus market, where companies like Stagecoach, Arriva, First Group and so on, they've carved up the UK market, Cathaoirleach, between them on geographical grounds and produced lucrative regional private monopolies. In Scotland you see the same type of situation, so there's no wonder, Minister, that there's now strong support for renationalising railway networks and rail operators following the disastrous performance of private sector companies. Minister, I think the impact in this important area of the policies of Fine Gael and the Troika are disastrous for public transport going forward, and that's the concerns I would have with the elimination of the RPA. I remember, for example, the RPA, the tremendous battle when Pádraig White was the chairman, that he and the RPA chief executive fought to extend the Luas into Connolly Station, to get the Luas into Connolly and to create an integrated dark Luas network, which Dublin so badly needed. This government, of course, has totally shelved major projects, like in particular Metro North, in my own constituency and region, and indeed Metro West, despite the necessity in relation to the huge economic fulcrum of Dublin Airport that Metro North should have been proceeded with. We had already spent, as you know, Cathaoirleach, €165 million on enabling works, and indeed a further 19 million on Metro West. Yet all of this has been abandoned by this government, and I think this gives a legislative framework to the abandonment of that policy. I note that in that context, Cathaoirleach, the distinguished transport engineer Cormac Rabbitte, he recently gave a presentation to members of Dublin City Council about Metro North, and he has said, based on his own detailed independent research, that a project with a similar route to the one previously identified for Metro North could be built for less than €2 billion. And based on recent CSO analysis, of course, for 2031, transport planners should now be examining public transport solutions for the 2025-2031 period for the 2 million people plus who will be living in the North Leinster, Greater Dublin regional Meath area. The NTA, I understand, has rejected Mr Rabbitte's research, but that's due, I believe, to the biased approach of favouring road-based transport solutions. The NTA raised issues about the cost of boring machines and the like, but the reality reality is, I think they didn't disprove the fundamental approach that engineer was offering as a possible solution to developing fast and quickly the kind of public transport networks which this capital city and indeed Cork City, and when I was your predecessor as transport spokesman for the Labour Party Minister, I proposed a Lewis network for Cork City and indeed for Galway City and for Limerick. That type of development, unfortunately, has now been abandoned, I believe, by this short-sighted bill. And I'd urge this Minister to look at this very, very carefully before this Dáil finally gives any kind of approval to that. So I have to say, Minister, I find this bill a concerning bill. I think it's geared towards road-based transport solutions rather than public transport. I think it's anti-urban Ireland, and I don't think it does what's necessary for public transport going forward in this country. Thanks, Cathaoirleach.